Chapter 9 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 9. It was with mixed feelings of fear and love that I started out with Giles early the next afternoon to walk over to Eric's. I had slept until nearly noon and felt, if not refreshed, at least calm. I realized instinctively that I had need to be calm. I felt that we were walking on to the conclusion of the drama. Annette had telephoned to Dr. Gresham, Eric's line being still out of order. I guess the poor fellow hadn't thought to do anything about it, and had learned that Julia was suffering only from a heavy cold. The doctor wouldn't say much, but he hinted that Julia's nerves were highly wrought up, that she ought to have a change. The sky was overcast, it was cold, and the wind was rising. Giles and I swung along the road against it, silent for a good quarter of an hour, during which, thanks to the healthy exercise and the buffeting wind, I straightened out my mind and arrived at a rational decision as to my stand and conduct in this affair. Believe me, there was one stark fact I could not but face. I had turned Eric away from my house as I would have turned a carrier of pestilence. I felt for Eric as keenly as I had ever felt, but with a difference. Much as I knew he was suffering, I tried to harden my mind to believe that it was his own fault. Yet, it really wasn't. I mean, he was not entirely blameworthy. He was acting almost as an animal would act, because something in his life had beaten him down to just that. He was determined to shun what had wickedly maltreated him. But, by Gemini, a man hasn't a right to his own life, not even to his own past. If he wishes to live wholly alone, that's different, but there's hardly a man who can do that. Life does not let him. You know that my sympathies are easily aroused. They had been greatly excited by the suffering, visible acutely only to me, of my two friends. Recent events, however, had shown me that sympathy, all in the guise of understanding, may be absurdly and dangerously blind. I was beginning to understand that afternoon what more thoughtful natures than mine understand in early manhood, what certain temperaments are aware of instinctively from the first. The conventions of society and the activities of business all point to the fact that a man is only a piece in a machine, really not self-important, but important only in his relations to others. Oh, I thought many things that are probably old and stale to the world, no matter how new to what Annette calls my simple nature. It isn't worthwhile recounting them. But I wasn't wholly converted. I could not turn Eric away from my house when he was in trouble. I had to turn him away, or my own flesh and blood, my son, would suffer cruelly. Just the same, I resented Giles prodding into Eric's past life. As if Giles and I had been thinking along the same line, he turned to me after we had gone a mile or so and said, "I'm sorry, Pierre. You didn't hear the story of the Snarts as I told it last night. Greer has been mixed up with them in the past. It's a remarkable—" "Don't, for heaven's sake, tell it to me," I cried. "It's an evil-sounding name, and I'm sure it was an evil family." "It was," said Giles laconically. "Then it's rotten luck that Julia and Eric, who are the salt of the earth, should have come to a house they had anything to do with." "Luck? Oh, no, not luck. There's a queer streak in human natures. Men come back to places for secret reasons, for feelings they cannot resist." "More than men come back," I said. "Look here, Pierre," Giles began sharply. "You know that, simple-minded as you are, you indulge yourself too much in the luxury of the dramatic, of the melodramatic, indeed. You'll pass for a gentle soul, not too fiery, content with what the French call the menus plaisir. You're honest and kind and trustworthy, but upon my soul sometimes I think you're a good deal of a damned fool." I could not keep from smiling, partly because it was so like Giles, so true to type, as he would say, to pitch into me with interpretations of myself, partly because to be called a damned fool on that afternoon was strangely comforting. But I didn't say anything. I think that perhaps it's because I held my mouth shut so much during these horrid days that I ever wrote this story at all. I used to feel ashamed then. Now I don't. Well, Giles went on. "In regard to this affair between Mr. and Mrs. Greer, they are nervous, sensitive, and highly strung, not the sort of people you have seen much of or can be expected to understand. Therefore they take on in your mind an heroic shape and trail you along into a world of myths and goblins. The house they live in, which I grant is not up to date, gives you the creeps. The figures of speech they use assume in your imagination a grotesque reality.
On such things your simple mind loves to dwell, and you think them over and over, until your too easily stimulated imagination jumps out of your control, and you're no longer responsible for what you claim to see and hear. You must control your mind and use it. You must take facts for what they are.
He would have gone on and on, but I said, Giles, you are a wiser man than I, and for these few remarks on myself, many thanks. I suppose experience teaches us to know ourselves, and I am learning in this, which will always remain one of the most horrible in my life. I know that Annette thinks my mind is diseased. You think that it is unexercised, uncontrolled. Strangely enough, I think that my wits are about me. Now, let me talk a little more. There are what you call facts. Well and good. You can say that in French for me if you want to. I will grant that my keen sympathy for Julia, and for Eric too, may have made me a little blind. But they like me. There's one fact, and neither an unexercised mind nor a too keen sympathy can do away with the fact that Julia and I, too, have... I could not say it.
The great fact, Giles broke in, is that Eric Greer has kept to himself something that, by preying on him, has begun to prey on his wife.
And on his friends.
True. Crime or misadventure, and I am inclined to think there are both, the one perhaps palliated by the other, something in his past life which demands an accounting or a confession. There's my explanation. What's yours? Remember, I can substantiate what I claim.
I preferred to keep silent, and we walked on without a word, tramp, tramp, against the wind, along the flat highway, until the hemlocks by Eric's house hove in view. Then Giles turned suddenly to me and said,
When there's a rotten thing in a man, the surgeon must cut it out. Watch, Eric, whatever happens this afternoon. I am glad Julia will not be present.
That took the wind out of me. I could not imagine what Giles had arranged for. My dear little flivver was standing in the driveway by the door, and just as we came up, Eric stepped from the house, evidently about to drive it back to me. When he saw us, however, he stood waiting, a finger on his lips.
How, I whispered, is Julia?
She's asleep just now,
he whispered back.
The doctor judges that her cold is not serious, but I think we will go away for a change in a day or two.
He looked pale and haggard, and his hand, as I took it, felt cold. Giles had little to say. I cannot fancy that Eric and Giles could ever have had much to say to each other, the one visionary and reserved, the other rather cynical and very outspoken. There was a pause of a minute or so, embarrassing to all of us. But though Eric was preoccupied, I think he did not want us to jump into the Ford and go back at once. After a while he collected himself enough to invite us to be seated on the little veranda to the left of the front door. There happened to be 3 old chairs there. Giles looked at his watch.
It's about 4, he said to me. I say, Greer, could you give us a drop of tea?
I've told you that such bluntness was what I envied in Giles.
Pharaoh, Eric responded. I'm sorry, I think the household is a little disorganized, and since Julia's asleep now, perhaps we'd better stay out of doors. You'll have to indulge me anyhow. I've got 100 things to do about shutting up the house. My mind's disturbed too, but we can sit here a little while if you like, though we'd better talk quietly. Julia's right up there.
And he pointed to the corner room.
Have a cigar then, Eric,
I offered, forgetting that he did not smoke. He declined it and tipped his chair back against the wall. Giles and I were both facing him. From the way he pulled his cap down over his eyes and rested his head against the wall, I thought he must be tired, and his face, what I could see of it, was hollow and lined. "So you're going to leave us," I began. "Where are you going?"
"Julia will go to stay with her cousin in a little town upstate."
"You are not going with her?"
"No," Eric replied in a very low voice. I...
It sounded as if he had made up his mind to say he had to go elsewhere for reasons of business, but he broke off. I wondered if Julia and he had come to an understanding. I saw Giles look at his watch again, and it struck me as queer because not 5 minutes could have passed since he had looked at it before. Alongside the veranda, the dead leaves on the bushes were rattling in the cold wind which tore round the corner of the house. I fancied I heard a sort of banging in the distance, as of a loosened shutter. Everything was restless, gray and chill, and we 3 men, alone on the bleak veranda, must have looked forlorn. Eric, pulling his cap yet lower over his face, so that all I could see of it was his mouth and chin, said to me,
"I suppose, Pierre, you don't know of anyone who would hire this house."
"Furnished?"
"Why, perhaps that depends."
The thought of Eric's leaving the neighborhood, together with the cold dreariness of the day, the knowledge that the sprightly Julia, who used to enliven us so, was lying sick in one of the gloomy rooms above us, and the premonition that something disagreeable was going to happen, made an ordinary business conversation strange indeed. No, I thought the chances very unfavorable. Tenants for that sort of house would be rare in these days anyhow, and at this time of the year, etc., etc.
"If I felt like selling, Pierre," Eric went on in a dreary voice, "how much would the place bring?"
"How much land do you own?"
"What you see here within the trees and perhaps out to the road."
"Well, it wouldn't bring very much, I'm afraid, Eric. Perhaps 2,500, possibly 3,000.
"So little."
I saw a bitter smile twist his lips.
"So little,"
he repeated, and the cold wind swept his words away.
"It was hardly worth it."
I turned round to size up the land, to do anything rather than submit to the spirit of desolation that was moaning about us. There it was, the short, empty driveway, curving from under the hemlocks as from a tunnel, the half-moon of land within it, the little bit of lawn on either side where the grass was already dead and brownish. "Afraid not more, Eric," I sighed, and turned back to face him. "I'm afraid not more." Though I could not see his eyes, I knew that he had suddenly fixed them upon something behind me, something that must have come into the driveway in the last second. So sure was I of this that out of curiosity I should have turned round again, but for the amazing transformation which came over him, and which held me fixed in my chair and powerless to move. His jaw dropped so that his mouth hung open. He put up a trembling hand to cover his eyes, pushing back the cap from his brow as he did so. Then, very slowly, as if at the cost of great effort over himself, he brought that hand back to the arm of his chair. I saw his eyes, dilated, horrified, starting out of their sockets. Still, with a slowness that to me was excruciating, he lowered one foot from the rung of the chair, feeling for the floor of the veranda, finding it, and then he let the chair, which had been tilted back against the wall of the house, come forward on its 4 legs. Slowly, terribly slowly, he regained control of himself, closed his mouth, set his jaw. Behind me I heard the crunching of steps on the gravel. Someone was approaching, more or less hesitatingly, but steadily. Someone whose appearance must have been to Eric as unspeakably, what shall I say, blasting, as the apparition of the female spectre of malice had been to me. Even Giles groaned, overcome by the look on Eric's face. That ever-fine, handsome features, so often aglow with ardor and love, could become such a mask of hateful tragedy. He was getting to his feet, his loose raincoat fastened by only one button, flapping and almost tearing in the wind. Instinctively, I put out a hand towards him. He did not see it. He saw nothing but what was approaching him with steps that were beginning to falter. Under his breath, he said,
"Come on. I am not afraid of you, you rotting white devil."
It was not more than a whisper, but it was terrible. Suddenly he stiffened to his full height. He snatched his cap from his head and flung it on the floor. Nostrils dilated and quivering, eyes blazing, he stamped on the floor. His hair blew like a wild man's in the strong, cold wind. He cried out with all the power of his full voice, "Come on, I say! What do you want?" There was about him at that moment a nobleness of rage, a majesty of defiance, something greatly heroic. I was fascinated by him. I could not take my eyes from him, and I only heard what went on. A rather lisping voice, a woman's, answered,
"I want to see Mr. Greer."
"Mr. Greer," replied Eric, still in that extraordinarily resonant trumpet-like voice, "is not at home. He has gone away."
"Oh," said the woman, "then I will come again."
I heard her footsteps as she retreated, and when they had grown faint in my mind told me that the woman had descended into the tunnel through the hemlocks and gone out of sight. Then I saw Eric lay a hand on the veranda rail, vault over it, and light on the brown grass just beyond the bushes. He stumbled, but did not fall. Astounded, I turned to watch him. Crouching like a tiger, he darted across the lawn to the right, paused a second on a spot whence he could see that woman, now out of my sight, pursuing her way through the gloomily shadowed tunnel, darted a little farther, always to keep her in view across the lawn, down the driveway, into the tunnel. Maybe he stalked her thus as far as the road. I saw no more of him till he returned to us. "Heaven save us," I groaned. "What have you done, Giles?" But all Giles would say, and he said it again and again, was,
"She must have been dreadful. She must have been dreadful."
We waited without saying anything more, chilled by the comfortless, harsh wind, vague to each other in the failing gray light. And then Eric came back to us. Think of it. He was dazed, and he mounted the veranda steps warily. The force of the wind had torn the button from his coat so that the body of it flapped behind him. From his manner it was evident that he was quite unconscious of the staggering effect his dramatic lie had had upon us. And indeed, our amazement might well, from his point of view, have been quite negligible. Our moral sensibilities had been stunned, perhaps, but he... Well, he stopped and caught up his cap as the wind was blowing it away. Then he half sat on the rickety railing of the veranda, looking down at his cap, which he still held in his hands, and slowly fingered. His face was relaxed. "I thought," he said at last, "it was a woman who I know is dead." He dropped his cap and took hold of the railing.
"Huldah Snart?"
Giles asked, in a low, cold tone. I was shocked, but the effect of that name on Eric was like that of the touch of red-hot iron on a maddened animal. He sprang to his feet, wrenching the rail with such force as to tear it from its standards. It was rotten anyhow. But his wildness lasted only a few seconds. With what must have been a more than normally human effort, he calmed himself. "What makes you think that, Pharaoh?" he returned, speaking quite evenly.
"Because this woman, who has given you such a start, is her cousin, and is said to look astonishingly like her. There could never have been more than two such as they. Calm yourself, Greer."
"I am calm," said Eric. I took a long breath tentatively, to make sure my lungs could function. Giles's temerity had knocked me breathless.
"It was a sanctimonious family,"
Giles remarked, apparently incongruously.
"Was it?" "Yes, singularly colorless before the world, like that blanched fungus which grows in damp cellars. There was a sort of secret evil name in the neighborhood, though. That was colorless, too. They were cold-blooded, all abnormally blonde. I was going to tell you last night, when you interrupted me, that Morgan Snart built this house. I'm surprised you are not more curious about it."
"Who? Me?"
"Yes, especially you. You bought the house, you know. I suppose through Grimmer and Strode?"
Eric's reply was spoken quietly. But if the gale had burst into a hurricane, I could not have been more startled, or our mask of tranquility more wildly swept away.
"None of your business."
That's what he said. For the first and only time, I saw Giles flabbergasted. He paled with anger. He stood up and began speaking rapidly, the words almost tumbling over each other.
"I happen to know that Grimmer and Strode were Morgan Snart's executors. Through them I know that this house was never for sale. I know that on the death of Morgan Snart this house passed to his daughter, and on the death of a few hours later of his daughter it passed to—"
The name, if ever it was spoken, was drowned in Eric's loud, insane laughter. He threw back his head and laughed at the sky, peal after peal. It made me almost sick to hear him. I had not known laughter could be such a voice of anguish. All the time the wind was flapping his raincoat behind him, flattening his trousers against his thin legs. His long black hair, mixed with gray, tossed about his head and face. He laughed until I thought I must stuff my fingers in my ears. He lifted his hands high before him, and the section of the rotten railing he still held fell from them with a dull noise to the floor. Then he went slowly into the house, crying through his laughter,
"Oh, my wife Julia! Oh, my wife Julia!"
His terrible laughter still came to us from within. I was speechless. Giles said,
"Damned madman! Listen, Pierre."
"Shut up!" I cried. "Not a word. You've driven him mad. Keep your facts to yourself." Presently, in not more than a minute, Eric came out again. His laughter had been in our ears, but at the sight of us, whose presence he may have forgotten, he ceased laughing suddenly. The sudden silence was in itself unnerving. "No," he said, eyeing us mournfully. "I may not go to my wife Julia. I am forbidden." He looked curiously at Giles and pointed a finger at him. In the silence before he spoke again, I heard the distant banging of the loosened shutter. "I think you are a ghoul in a dead man's grave," he said in his habitual melancholy voice. "But you have not learned all. Even you do not know who died first." Before Giles could make any reply to this crazy statement, Eric stepped from the porch and walked out of our sight into the blackness of the hemlocks. He did not leave us to silence. There was always the wind and the banging of that shutter, and then I heard a weak voice above my head calling, "Eric! Eric!" Oh, but it sounded miles away, over a wind-torn sea. "Eric! Eric!" I knew Eric was out of his head. I ran into the house. Darkness was falling outside. Within was already deepest gloom. I rushed upstairs. Like a wanderer in a nightmare, I knew not where or which door for me to find. But I paused and listened and tried, and at last I opened a door and walked into a chamber where, almost invisible in the dusk, little Julia lay in a great bed. "Julia," I said, going softly to the bedside, "Eric is away. I am Pierre." "Stay with me a moment. I am frightened. I dreamed I heard Eric laughing like a man gone mad." "What a horrid dream, Julia." "Where is Eric?" "I will find him." "Yes, find me Eric. He must not be alone with his black thoughts." "I will find him, Julia, but is it best to bring him back to you? You are not strong. The night is here." Though the whole house was trembling in the force of the wind, cheerless, dark, and full of draughts, yet for the time being it was empty of evil. Never did those sinister spirits lurk in its corners or lope along its shadowy walls while the master was away. Only the memory of dread now haunted it. For the present all was actually well, though dreary and under the spell of a foreboding. I should have been glad to prevail upon Julia not to call back Eric from wandering abroad with his black thoughts, with his malevolent familiars. If only he could have slipped them a mile or so away upon the road, and left them bobbing and fluttering against the wind, powerless to follow him. But that he could not do. They would come into the house with him. They were strong after sundown. Julia was weak. This night, the odds would be with them. "Julia, I will find Eric, but let me take him away with me." "I am afraid to be alone." "I will fetch Annette. She will stay with you tonight. Giles is downstairs, too." "Pierre," she said calmly, thinking for my boy, "you cannot take Eric to your house, you know." "Yes, I know," I repeated, shuddering. "If I am to die tonight, I want Eric with me." "You will not die tonight, Julia. Not of your cold." "No, not of my cold," she whispered hoarsely. It was so dark I could hardly make out her form in the bed, but I knew she had relapsed into a state of exhaustion, so I went downstairs to the ford. Giles was sitting where I had left him. He was still angry, but puzzled more, to know what Eric's last cryptic words had meant. I requested him to stay at the house, at least until I returned with Annette. Then I started off, but I did not go at once to my own home. I drove a mile up the highway in the other direction, looking for Eric. The twilight had deepened into night. If Eric had left the road, I could not hope to see him. But until I turned back towards my house, I thought my lights might pick him out ahead of me. Even after I turned, I rather thought I had guessed wrong on the direction he had taken, and that I should discover him on the road the other way. But I didn't, though my eyes were strained for the sight of him. Where was he on this wild night? I will say that I never imagined him gone to the high cliffs over the river to make an end of himself. I apprehended nothing worse than roaming half the night in search of him and passing the other half beside him, still tramping, perhaps, but perhaps before a fire at the Caraway Club. That could be arranged. As I drew near my home, having missed him so far on the way, I put on all speed. There was a chance that he had set out for my house. I meant that he should not enter it. He wasn't there. The children were in the kitchen with Annette having their supper. I kissed them good night there and called Annette into the living room. A fire was blazing on the hearth, and the room was warm and cheerful. It was hard to tell my wife we must leave it.
"But I can't leave the children alone tonight," she cried. "I can't do it. You know the telephone is out of order, too."
Yet I persuaded her to come with me. She saw that I dreaded what was ahead of me that night. We hoped—I don't know what we hoped, but I had a premonition that the matter was going to be settled one way or the other. It might be settled early. It might be settled late. I remember one poignant detail of our departure. That was the sound of the bolts shot to behind us. It seemed like a defiance to Eric. Why, Annette put the children to bed herself in our room. She made Felicia promise to sleep on a couch in the same room and to lock the room door. She insisted upon Felicia's closing the front door behind us almost before we had crossed the threshold, and she would not leave the porch until she had heard the click of the bolt shot home inside. All against Eric, who was wandering half-crazed with some terrible secret grief through a cold, wild, and friendless night. I see Annette now making her way down the granolithic walk in the light of the Ford lamps, holding her hat on her head against the wind, her wide-mouthed knitting bag inflated and pulling at her arm, her skirts slashing like the canvas flap of a tent. She went first and I followed her. So we had often gone to the theater. And now the curtain was about to rise on the last act of the strangest drama and the most terrible I have ever witnessed. End of Chapter 9.